Hello, Brad here, just to say we're super proud that the Friday 5pm podcast is sponsored by the Malt Miller, the UK's best home brew store.
We use the Malt Miller for all of our homebrew experiments, as well as tapping them up for advice and binging on their awesome YouTube channel all the time.
That's why whenever we release a homebrew video, we put a recipe kit live on the Malt Miller, so you can brew with the exact same amazing ingredients that we did. The same ingredients used by pro brewers.
So alongside the Malt Miller's nitro-flushed hops, cold-stored yeast and milled-to-order malts, you can pick up recipe kits for our 5 Points Best Bitter, Russian River West Coast IPA, and now the fastest beer in the world, a hazy session IPA that goes from grain to glass in less than 48 hours.
Sign up to their newsletter at tinyurl.com/Malt Miller to get 5% off your first order. With the Malt Miller's amazing customer service and Johnny's 48-hour recipe, you could order the ingredients on a Monday and be drinking the beer by the weekend.
Speaking of which, it's Friday.
It's 5pm.
So enjoy this week's Friday 5pm podcast.
I love that stuff. Been drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. You know, I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it. Hops to it. You know, I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it. Hops to it.
Hi beer lovers, and welcome to the first episode of The Bubble, the podcast making you think differently about beer. My name's Johnny, I'm your host, and I'm here with my co-host, Rob Young.
Hello. So the bubble, tell us about the bubble, Johnny. Where did it come from, and who we are, and where did we come from?
So the bubble was sort of born out of a slight frustration perhaps with the echo chamber of the craft beer bubble, as it were. So we thought it was about time that rather than taking the views of the same people again and again in the same places over the same beers, we should get out there, meet some other people who maybe don't know that much about beer but know a hell of a lot about what we're going through. So the idea of the bubble is to escape that echo chamber that we're all caught in by introducing and interviewing lots of really interesting people that have a slightly different take on it.
And then I suppose also within that, interviewing people that are in the beer industry about things that are maybe slightly less beer related, how they arrived at this point in their careers, how their breweries grew, about just talking about all the beery nerdery that surrounds it.
Yeah, it's sort of trying to, we all have most of us have lives outside of the craft beer.
Do you?
Small ones, very insular. So we wanted to explore that and see what other people do, and potentially that way find out what inspired them to do what they do within the craft beer industry.
Brilliant. So I think why Johnny and I wanted to do this was because of just the general frustration with a lack of beer podcasts that were interesting outside the sort of beer geekery. Both of us have a mutual love for things like the Adam Buxton podcast, Science-ish, lots of things like that they're quite broad podcasts, and it makes it a lot more inclusive for everyone to listen to.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Science-ish is a great example because it's about film, but you don't even have to have seen the film to actually care about the topics that they're talking about. And that's what's missing from podcasts at the moment. There are lots of great beer podcasts that cover from sort of your down the pub kind of chat, like Beer O'Clock Show, all the way up to deep dive, personality-based ones like Good Beer Hunting. But none of them really tackle the actual people and the processes that are behind beer as a whole, which is what hopefully we'll be doing while making it accessible to anybody who hasn't tried the beer or doesn't even know what craft beer is about.
I do love Belgium Smack, though, and that is about as geeky as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, we need a beer podcast world as varied as the beer world that we exist in as well.
So yeah, there hopefully will be quite a lot of Adam Buxton-esque things that you'll notice through this podcast as well. There'll be a barking dog, almost definitely, coming up in this show. My small dog, Lorne, the sausage dog, is sat beside us at the moment, and he loves to bark.
He loves to bark.
So yes, you'll hear that, much like Rosie from the Buxton podcast. There will be jingles, some of which will be coming up later on. Beery jingles. Turns out really difficult to make a jingle.
Really? You've been struggling?
Struggling.
That's why we've only got two currently.
Yeah, Buxton does a good job of churning them out.
But what else does he do, you know?
That's true.
It's just jingles and podcasts now.
So this podcast is a bit of a prequel to the up-and-coming episodes. We just thought we'd do a quick one to introduce ourselves. A lot of you listening will know Johnny from the Craft Beer channel, but nearly all of you listening will not know who I am.
You're the detective from Peaky Blinders, right?
Am I? Is he Northern Irish?
He is.
There you go. I'm the detective from Peaky Blinders. We'll introduce the man you all know first, Johnny the Hitman Garrett.
Yeah, so I run a YouTube channel called the Craft Beer channel, which you might have come across, but it's highly likely you haven't. And we started 5 years ago, just kind of as a hobby. I used to work for Jamie Oliver, and he started FoodTube, which was his food YouTube channel. And I got obsessed through marketing that and that kind of side, got obsessed with YouTube channels and discovered that no one was quite doing BeerTube right. A lot of reviews in bedrooms, a lot of sort of 30-minute epic interviews with no editing with brewers, and I thought nobody's actually taking a kind of editorial approach to this. So we started the Craft Beer channel. Jamie liked it, so we put a couple of episodes on his channel, and that's how it got to where it was. It was nothing to do with us. But now it's a little monster that just keeps on growing and swallowing up more time, but equally getting us to travel all over the world and meet amazing people, some of whom will hopefully be appearing on this.
Awesome. And then for me, I work with Johnny at a company called Cave Direct. We are one of the UK's biggest independent beer importers, so we deal with a lot of Belgian breweries, German breweries, some Scandi ones, and then quite a lot from the UK and America. So I have worked with Cave for 3 years. Before that, I worked for Meantime. I hear you all sighing at me.
They used to be good, man.
Everyone has to start somewhere. And before that, I worked for companies like the Draft House and the Dean Swift in the pub game, which is where a lot of us started in this trade. So I head up the sales team for the south of Cave Direct, and Johnny is our one-man marketing team. Yeah, so
just put my thumbs up, but it's a podcast, so yeah. I need to learn these bits.
So we work for Cave Direct and Beer Merchants, and most of these episodes will be filmed or at the Beer Merchants tap in Hackney Wick. And we will be drinking their beers and talking about beers with all our guests here, more often than not, unless they don't want to travel to us.
And full disclosure, like some of the breweries and the people that we chat to will be part of our world in Cave Direct. But luckily, it's a very broad church, Cave Direct. You know, like Rob said, we work with so many countries, so many breweries. And it won't purely be those guys, but it will spend a lot of time in the tap, because that's where we spend a lot of time.
All our time.
Yeah, all our time, yeah. So the other thing to note is this podcast is sponsored by Beer Merchants, and you can go to beermerchants.com to get 800 different beers, all direct to your door, often within 48 hours, sometimes within 24, which still surprises me.
Amazing. And it's got a huge list that spans even more countries than the Cave Direct portfolio. There's a lot of good stuff on there. So a lot of lambic for all you lambic lovers out there, some American beers. So yeah, check it out if you want quality. So tell us, Johnny, how did you get into beer? Where did your beer journey begin?
My beer journey started... I've actually got two origin stories, and they can't both be true, but I remember both of them happening. One of them is a pint of Camden Hells in the Horseshoe back in it must have been 2010, when I lived with a bunch of my best friends, and we were all supposed to be revising for our end-of-year exams, and instead we went to the pub. And all had a pint of Camden Hells, which turned into 2, which turned into 3, which turned into 4, which turned into not a very good result in the exam the next day. But we were blown away by how good it was. Like, having a lager that was properly bitter was a bit of a surprise to us. And we'd all been ale drinkers, so we'd been used to a bit more bitterness. So we enjoyed that. And then the other origin story I have is the Stag in Hampstead, which in my head must have been at least a year later. And that was a pint of Red Hook IPA, which I purely ordered because of the massive hammer that used to be the tap handle. I was like, well, that's got to be good. It's got a hammer for a tap handle. And that, I think, was the first American IPA I ever had. And nowadays it's seen as like a little bit old school. Certainly now that New England brewing has become so fashionable, but it was citrusy, piney, bittersweet, none of the things that you kind of associate with keg beer, or like I did in 2011, 2012. And it blew my mind, and again, 3 or 4 pints later, I was truly converted. So which one of those is true, I don't know. They both happened. I just don't know which one was the conversion. What about you, Rob?
Mine started a lot younger than you, actually. Unbelievably, I started getting into beer at 8 years old. There we go.
There he is.
Bark number one, bark count. At about 7 or 8 years old, which is mad. I wasn't drinking it.
That's a lot younger.
Yeah. I started collecting beer mats. So my sister is 10 years older than me. So when she was like 17, 18, she was going to the pub. And I started collecting beer mats. I can't really remember why. I think my neighbour might have collected them. So I got into it, but I always sort of loved beer culture. Like my dad would always go to a pub called JONNY'S in a place called Bangor, where I'm from, and he would like go out for pints on a Saturday night. He still does between 5 and 7, and bizarrely, actually, it's where I had my first pub job. But he would talk about the beers and things like that. He was a Guinness drinker, or maybe a Smithwick's. There's not very many beers to choose from in Northern Ireland.
What is Smithwick's?
It's kind of like a brown ale, I suppose. It doesn't have a lot of taste. But yeah, so there was like quite a lot of culture of like going out to the pub for dinner and things like that. So I was surrounded by it, not drinking it at 7. I waited at least 2 years. But my sister would collect me beer mats. I still got them all. I've got a huge selection of these beer mats from circa 96.
They could be worth something. I think Boca Bailey might want them or something.
My favourite one is a Boddington's one, and it's a yellow beer mat, and it just has an ice cream cut out of it, and it says Cream of Manchester, and it is beautifully designed. Then I took a bit of a break from my beer drinking between the ages of 10 and 15, and then I had a fairly standard relationship with beer as a kid, sort of just drinking shitty lagers that were available in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is quite a bit behind England, or London specifically, so when things are starting to bubble over here, when I lived over there wasn't really anything. But I worked at a bar in Bangor, and the manager was, by today's terms, pretty tame, but by then it was quite extraordinary. He was like bringing in one bottle of the month, which was something different. And I got really into it, so I remember like Punk IPA coming over, unbelievably Odell's IPA, which probably tasted like toilet, but to me it was a taste sensation.
Compared to Smithwick's.
Exactly. I'm trying to think what other beer, like some of them were so tame, but they were just different to like the norm of what was in Northern Ireland at the time. Like Crombacher was one. Yeah, exactly. Johnny had a funny look in his face. But we really didn't, apart from Diageo products or Tennent's products, we didn't have a lot of other beer coming across. It's so much better now. I don't get back home as often as I'd like, but you do see more breweries cropping up and more breweries coming across. So Boundary are pretty close to where I live. They're making some really good beers, and then all the usual offenders are sending bits and pieces over.
None of the beers you mentioned were sort of real ale. Was that less of a thing?
No real ale at all in Northern Ireland, bizarrely. Diageo have big controls of all the taps, so every pub sells the same beer.
Yeah,
every single pub. It is mad. But then I moved to London, and on my second day, I got a job in the Dean Swift at Gainsford Street near Tarbridge. And sort of walked into this job, and it was completely different than what I was used to. There was all these rotational beers, lines that needed cleaning all the time, all this stuff I'd never done before. But I mean, if you're slightly into beer, getting all that put in front of you, it doesn't take long to get really behind it. So I was drinking Colonel, Beavertown had just been released, drinking 8 Ball in the old bottles. Buxton were doing loads of stuff there, Magic Rock, and they're Curious, which is now called Ringmaster.
I've still got a bottle of Highwire as well back
Really?
home. I discovered it while I was moving house a couple of years ago, and I think they only did 1 or 2 batches that went into bottle.
Yeah, they did. It was really hard to get, and they had cool caps.
Yeah,
of a little Magic Rock man on the top. So yeah, that really just got me into it massively. I lived with my friend at the time. We moved over together and we worked together. And both of us just loved beer, and we'd go home and drink more beers and talk about beer all the time. So you got to know it very, very quickly. It was a bit of a baptism of fire because I was working in it and I was living in it. and it was when the sort of scene was kicking off in 2012, I think, which is mad because my first shift there was a Camden Wheat was on, which they don't make anymore. I think that was my first staff drink.
The wit or the
no,
there was a wheat
it
one.
was pre-wit.
Oh wow!
It was wheat. And then I went on to work for companies like Draft House and Meantime, as I mentioned, and then ended up at Cave about 3 years ago. And yeah, so I've been in the back scenes as the distributors are.
So as a man who is firmly entrenched in the bubble, what do you see as like the issues, the things that the beer bubble needs to learn from outside? What kind of stuff do you want to get into with the podcast, other than the ones we've already recorded?
I just think there's so much more than just the geekery behind it. I love beer because it's so cultural and social. Like, you go to the pub to drink beers and talk with your mates. You can talk about beers or music or any of the other amazing things you want to talk about but it is a social tool, beer, and I worry that if you get too into the inside the bubble, then it removes all the socialness of beer, and then deeming beer pointless, other than the getting drunk side, which I also like.
Well, we'll certainly do a podcast on people that like to get drunk. That's definitely on my list. Another one I really love to dig into, and guys who are listening, if you have any ideas, please do send them to us. Like, tag in Beer Merchants or Craft Beer Channel, and we'll find you. But one about the hype machine or the social interactions online and the bizarre twisted knots we tie ourselves into as we argue about what is mostly inconsequential things. And I think it's a really interesting psychological piece that could be done there.
Yeah, I think the hype surrounding beer at the moment is fascinating. How into it people get, and it's brilliant, and it's great for the beer industry that people are so passionate about it, but I worry that it could become a bit self-destructive.
We don't want to be like wine, do we, where there's a definite wine world and prices go up and people start forging different beers and stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure that already happens. Thankfully, canning, I think, makes it a bit harder to do. But then the wraparound labels, suddenly it's easier again. Who knows? Who knows? There's a podcast in that before I start just having internal conversations with myself.
Making falsified beer, just you steaming off labels.
Exactly,
the crime.
This is definitely Treehouse Julius, definitely.
So yeah, as I mentioned, part of the reason we wanted to do this was to make beer a bit more inclusive and get outside the bubble, and there's a lot of influence, and I did say to you, Johnny, that there needed to be Buxton-esque jingles. So yeah, I've made our first jingle with my very talented friend Paddy Baird. So I'll play it for you, and then you can let me know what you think. So this is called Blue Moon Day.
Blue Moon Day. Strong already. Strong already.
Oh, I think it's got a yeast infection. Yeast infection.
Infected Blue Moon. Is there any more thrilling thought?
Yes, so that actually is the song Blue Monday by New Order, but instead of the synthesizer being a synthesizer, it is a can of 8-wired cucumber Berliner Weiss opening.
And no beer was harmed. You drank the beer,
We
right?
drank the beer. It didn't have a yeast infection.
Oh.
It was donated by the guys at New Zealand Beer Collective, actually. Gave me a can of it to try. So I brought it round to my friend Paddy's house. We cracked it open and sampled it for Blue Moon Day.
There you go. There's plenty more gold to come where that came from.
Hopefully they'll get better. But yeah, it's difficult to make them concise enough. and funny. Turns out I'm not a comedian like Adam Buxton.
That's one way in which this will vary. Get away from the blueprint of Buxton's podcasts. Well, if you have any ideas, guys, any pun-related jingles you think we could whap out, do let us know. But in the meantime, that's all we really had to say for the introduction podcast. We'll see you out with Rob's second jingle in a second. But this is just quickly a shout out for the next podcast. It's the first one we're releasing. It's already live. It's called Sellouts. It's an interview with John West, who is a journalist in the murky world of market makers who broker deals between different companies. So he works in that journalist world and has lots of insights to do with that, and teaches us all about how the sellout process happens, why some of it's controversial, why some of it isn't, and why you should definitely go into company's house and work out who is next. So yeah, that podcast is already live, so just click on the playlist when you exit this. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll be joining us for many years to come.
So long, suckers.
I love that stuff. Been drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. Drinking it for years. You know, I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it. Hops to it. You know, I heard they recently decided to add more hops to it.